recognised, which is a really great thing, because the point of this this session is to reach people beyond our own EGA region. So great to have you here today. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you, I'm working from home today on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Feel free to pop your country in the chat, knowing that we've got a pretty good mix of people from across Victoria and maybe even a few interstates. If there's any, so my name's Melanie Cutler. I'm the project officer for EGA, the Eastern Alliance for Greenhouse Action. And I managed largely the project from EGA's side that we'll be talking about today. I've got Scott McHenry here with me today. He's the Executive Officer of EGA. I'm guessing a fair few of you will know Scott. He's been in the local government climate space for a long time, and he'll be monitoring the questions in the chat. So feel free to add questions anytime during the session, and we'll hopefully have a good amount of time to get to those at the end. And I think there might be a few EGA council reps here today as well, just seeing some of those names. So they might be able to actually be quite helpful in terms of answering questions at the end as well, given that they were part of the project. So thank you to those EGA crew who've joined us today. Yes, just a flagging of the recording, obviously. Probably fine to keep your camera off anyway for the most of the session, given there's quite a lot of us. But I guess a particular mention if you'd prefer not to be recorded. And yep, I've already mentioned questions in the chat. Feel free to pop those in as soon as they come to you. And otherwise, I reckon let's get going. Let's hope there we go. Cool. All right, so we'll be talking today about this project that we called Reporting FOGO Impacts. The two key outputs for the project were the final report, which was obviously EGA focused, but it was a summary of our emissions reduction data. And then this calculated tool, which I'm guessing is probably the reason most of you are here today, because it is applicable and freely available to use for any council in Australia. So really just flagging that both of those outputs are freely available already on the EGA website. And I will be doing a bit of a skim version of both the findings and the tool walkthrough today, because actually there's an in-depth tool walkthrough. It goes for about 25 minutes and was recorded by the consultants, Blue Environment. So if you're actually going to be using the tool, I would highly recommend that you watch that first. So today is not meant to kind of duplicate that stuff already, but more to give you a bit of a snapshot and an overview of what the project was, so you can figure out whether it might be useful for you. So a bit of a quick recap on what we actually did and kind of what happened as a project. So our headline ask really was wanting to form a robust methodology for figuring out what the emissions reduction impact was of the FOGO programs across the EGA region. And just for a bit of context, a few years ago, EGA commissioned what we called the Community Net Zero Technical Analysis, which was a big piece of work looking at community emissions and what elements of that council had kind of control over or could influence, what was, the big pieces we could look at and that kind of thing. So it was a big piece of work. And one of the findings that came out of that was that there was an opportunity in the FOGO space for better understanding and collecting and collating data about FOGO emissions to use for councils to kind of demonstrate the impact at that municipal level in that space. So we could see it was a big piece of the pie, but we didn't really have credible ways to talk about the emissions reduction impacts of it. So that was the step one. Step two was, as EGA, trying to do a bit of an in-house having a go at calculating the emissions reduction. And I guess what happened was we pretty quickly realised it's pretty complicated, as anyone who's kind of dabbled in that carbon accounting emissions reduction space will probably appreciate. And so really wanting to make sure we could have that robust methodology meant that we ultimately went to market and commissioned consultants who were Blue Environment to do that really technical piece for us. And the outputs we're talking about today are the product of that phase of work. And just in terms of what we meant when we were measuring emissions reduction, the key piece of it obviously was the emissions from the landfill and from the composting of FOGO. So that's the big piece of the pie. But we did also include transport emissions to do with collecting both the garbage and FOGO streams, and also the waste facility emissions, so the electricity and other emissions coming from the waste facilities themselves. So as I've already mentioned, the two key outputs were the summary report and the tool. And essentially within what we were comparing within that was a full year of FOGO data from actually being implemented in the council. So looking at the actual tonnes of waste that were collected. And we compared that to a pre-FOGO year where there was no FOGO in place. And then the Blue Environment did a good job of making this BAU case kind of based on a rolling baseline. So we weren't comparing years ago when the population was different, electricity emissions factors might have been different, but they kind of updated that. And so what you end up looking at is your actual emissions with your current FOGO garbage mix compared to where you'd be at today with current population and emissions factors if you hadn't implemented FOGO. So that's ultimately what we'll see in the outputs. So in terms of what was needed from councils, and I guess what would be needed from you as a council if you wanted to use the tool, was needing to provide the tonnages of both the landfill and the FOGO collections. And you do need a full 12 months of FOGO implementation. So you do need to make sure you've had that going for a full year before you can use the tool effectively. And then councils also provided their bin audit data. So what actually is in the bin, both in the garbage bin and the FOGO bin, although there are default values built into the tool if you don't have recent audit data that's suitable. And then at the end of the project, obviously, each council received their own individualised emissions calculator that had all of their own numbers in it, with the idea being that we've also got this blank template version, which you can use to produce your own individualised calculator. And as we'll see when we look at the tool in a minute, they are designed for reuse year after year so that you can actually start to understand trends as well and measure cumulative emission savings. Okie dokie. So I'm guessing the vast majority of you will kind of understand the regions and potentially are connected in with another Greenhouse Alliance. But just for the sake of getting everybody up to speed, this is the EGA region. So we are 8 councils across Eastern Metro Melbourne. Probably the main sort of point of interest for this project was just that we do have some of those more very inner city urban councils who are dealing with particular issues around space and lots of different dwelling types and that kind of thing, right out to Yarra Ranges, which is essentially kind of a peri-urban council with a very different landscape and greenery and that kind of thing. So not all councils on the same page. But yes, all of the councils in EGA have FOGO. Obviously, they would have needed to use the tool. They implemented it somewhere between, the first one was in 2018, the latest was in 2023. But they do have a mix of service configurations, which we'll also see a little bit later, both in terms of frequency. So some councils are collecting weekly, some fortnightly, and also scope. So some are universal and some are voluntary. So hopefully that kind of sets the scene of where we were. The next step is going to be a quick look at the tool to kind of give you a better sense of how it actually works. And then we'll come back to have a look at some of the findings from the EGA region, hopefully to just give you a bit of a sense of the kind of insights that we got from the process as a region. So I'm just going to stop sharing that one and bring up the tool. It's an Excel tool, so relatively user-friendly. Quite a lot of sheets, but I'll just basically walk our way through the sheets. Are you seeing that, Scott? It's all looking right. Cool. Yep. So as I said, I'll move relatively quickly through this, and I am aware that it's a pretty complex document. There are a lot of numbers and a lot of pages. So please don't feel like this, you need to understand every nitty-gritty bit. As I said, that recording that the Blue Environment team did for us is really thorough and paced really well. And obviously you can rewatch it in your own time. So if you feel like you're going to use it, absolutely go and look at that first. But just to give you an overview, we obviously have a contents page, which just kind of sets up the parameters of the types of cells and how we intended to be used. And you'll see all of these yellow tabs down here, which I'll look at next, are ones where you need to enter data. And then at the end, we've got the black tabs, which is where we'll see the outputs. So in terms of what data you need to put in, firstly, it's about the basics of the 2 years that you want to compare. So every single council in Australia is in here as part of this drop-down. Just flagging that the data that we're looking at today is not real. So I've chosen Melbourne, as in City of Melbourne, just as a default, but the data in here is not theirs. It's a kind of imaginary mashup of a few of the eager councils. So it doesn't actually represent any particular region, but it's not a bad way to just kind of see how the tool works. So aside from selecting your council on this page, you do the setup essentially of the 2 years you want to compare. So what we call the pre-FOGO baseline is choosing a financial year where you didn't have FOGO implemented at all. So you'll need to put that year in and some of the basics of the garbage tonnage. And also worth noting here that if you had garden organics, so you're already collecting green bins, but just without food in them, this is where you'd also register that and capture any tonnage you were getting of greenery. And then after you've done that pre-FOGO year, down here, you've got the post-FOGO. So this is the one that if you do it every year, you would be updating to your most recent year of data and using that to make the comparison with that pre-FOGO year. So a few fairly straightforward things to enter there to set things up. Then we move on to what's in the bins. So firstly, we're looking at the red lidded bins, the garbage bins. And again, we need to look at the pre-FOGO year, the baseline year, and the post year. So for the garbage bin before you had FOGO, you're putting in the audit of what was actually in the bin. This is the part where you would be using your audit data if you have it, but if you don't, you tick the box up here and it'll bring in the default composition based on the state averages. So you'll do that for the pre-year and then coming across here, it's exactly the same process, but just having a look at what was the composition of the garbage bin after FOGO was implemented. And then moving right along, we do exactly the same thing, but for the FOGO bins. So for the pre-FOGO year, if you were collecting green bins, obviously you will have some stuff here because you would have been collecting garden materials. But if you didn't have green bins operating at all at that point, then you'll just move on. And here is where we put what was in our green bins after we implemented FOGO. So it refers back a lot to the national, I can't even remember what NGAS stands for now, Scott, you can probably remember, but where the default comes from, and actually it also uses the categories from NGAS. So you will need to do, depending on the way you do your audits and the different categories that you have for categorising the waste, you will need to map those against the NGAS categories to make sure that the setup works. So you can see here on the left, this council's got very particular descriptions about particular things, and this column over here in column M is where they've mapped them to the NGAS groupings. All right, so now we've told the tool what was in the bins. The next couple of sheets are largely pre-populated, but if you plan to use it over the years, you will need to come back and add updated data because it doesn't exist yet for future years. So firstly, populations. So you can see here it's got the populations of every LGA in Australia, but as we get over to newer years, you'll have to update that. Obviously, you only need to update your own council. There's no need to put everybody's in, but that'll just make sure everything works well in the background. And same thing for landfill gas capture. So if you know the landfill gas capture of your landfills that you're using, then you actually put that in earlier in the sheet. But if you don't have access to that, then this will give you state averages as well. And it teaches you where to grab the future state averages, if you're using the tool in the future. The last of these background ones is electricity factors. So this is the emissions factors of the electricity distribution in your state. So again, we've got all the historical numbers there, and it teaches you, it's got the link there for you to go and grab the updated factors as the grid keeps evolving. Okay, now we get to the fun part, which is the results it spits out at the end. So this left-hand part of the dashboard, there's only a couple of these yellow editable cells, which are really just about some more detailed things around whether, or you can toggle it to be per capita, which is kind of interesting, or total. It is built in to include scope 4 emissions as an option, so avoided emissions. The default setting is excluding those because of it's kind of not yet kind of super credible in terms of like really being that robust methodology, but it is an interesting kind of other element to observe. So you can kind of toggle that on and have a look at the impact of avoided emissions on top of the actually measured reduced emissions. Cool, but the most interesting bit is over here, which is actually the summary of the results. So this is a summary of what you would have put in of how the garbage and FOGO tonnes have changed. And then these bigger numbers down here are the headline. This one here really in the cell in row K is the big number, which is the tonnes of emissions reductions that year based on implementing FOGO. So they've also put some nice other options here in terms of capturing what that means in terms of cars off the road or trees planted. And the reason they did that was very much around supporting communications and kind of other ways that you could potentially share the information back with community about the impact of your FOGO program. And there are a few graphs here which just visualize that. So this is by bin type. So you can see that from pre to post FOGO, obviously the emissions from the garbage strain have gone down heaps. The emissions from the FOGO bins have gone up slightly, but obviously gone up by far less than the garbage emissions have come down. So then this graph over to the right is the consolidated emissions reduction. In a simple graph, there's some graphs here around bin composition, which would be interesting, mainly over time. I guess we're wanting to see less food in the garbage bin. So that would be that comparison. And then the last sheet, which was at the request of the eager councils in the development process, which I think is a really great addition, is the ability to track over time. So the ideal, you'd need to save a different version of this Excel spreadsheet each year because you can only compare that pre-FOGO year to your current year. But if you save one master version, this sheet can be used to track year on year. So it becomes a very simple process once you've done the next year to just paste in these cells the key outputs straight from the tool, and then it will, the graphs aren't working here because I haven't put multi-years in, but it'll give you some really nice visuals of the changes in garbage collection. So hoping to see the tonnages come down in the garbage bin and go up in FOGO, but also this one would be your cumulative emissions savings, which obviously hopefully rises nicely over time. And there's also numbers here around the household food diversion rate, which I'll actually speak to a little bit when we look at the eager results, but it's a really interesting way to look at how the numbers are changing year on year. Cool. All right, that's the whirlwind of 1 million sheets and 1 million cells. Apologies if it's a lot quite quickly. I'll just come back to my slides.
Just a note while you're doing that, Mel, Nicholas said that the version of the tool attached to the meeting invite wasn't working for him. So I've just popped a link to the sheet that's available for download on the Eager webpage, just in the chat if anyone wants to grab it from there instead.
Oh, thank you, Scott. And yeah, absolutely. If anything isn't working, please follow up with us anytime. Because having done the work now, we figure it's the kind of thing we definitely don't want to be replicating. We want to be sharing and making sure it works as much as possible. So that's good. All right, here we are. I should have held off clicking over on the slide to have a drum roll, but these are the headline numbers from what it looked like in Eager from our pre-FOGO years to our 23-24 year, which was the year that we used when we had the full 12 months of data for every council. So really the key takeaway here is obviously that the dark blue lines are what our emissions would have been by council had we not implemented FOGO, and the light blue are our actual emissions. We can see that everybody dropped, although they did drop by different amounts. And the numbers to the left there around comparing the total amount of emissions from this compared to VECO, which I'm assuming if most of you are in local government Victoria will know is the Victorian Energy Collaboration, which is the fact that lots and lots, the vast majority now of Victorian councils are procuring 100% renewable electricity. So it's a huge emissions reductions project within the local government sector. And obviously community FOGO collections versus councils getting all of their own electricity from renewables are a very different thing. But really we're just noting here for scale that the tonnes of emissions associated with FOGO in the Eager region is larger than the emissions reductions from VECO in the Eager region. So not at all trying to be an apples and apples thing, but really just acknowledging that doing FOGO as a community, as a region, is a really impactful emissions reduction story, and absolutely worth talking about in terms of the kind of levers that local government are pulling and can pull around that community emissions reduction. Okay, the big takeaway findings, I think, for us, though, aside from obviously the probably expected outcome that emissions fell, was the impacts of the different service configurations, in particular, the graph on the left around collection frequency. So you can see there that 3 of our eager councils are doing fortnightly FOGO collections. The other 5 are doing weekly, and it's a really marked trend difference. Obviously, the bigger the line goes down, the bigger the emissions reduction. It really is a step change for those that are doing it weekly versus fortnightly. And the other way we looked at it was around that universal versus voluntary option. And probably the most interesting element of that is the Maroondah piece, because Maroondah are universal, but they're only fortnightly. And you can show that sort of shows that the impact is far more about the frequency than it is about the universal versus voluntary. So you can see for Knox, for example, technically has an opt-out program. I'm actually not sure of the percentage of opt-out versus participating, but by the virtue of the fact that they're weekly, their emissions reductions are still on par with the other universal delivery models. So yeah, that was a pretty big takeaway. It caused some really good, robust discussion as the eager councils thinking about, oh yeah, why are we making the decision to do fortnightly, weekly? What are the levers for that? And obviously aware that the lens in this project is 100% around emissions. We weren't looking at the commercial side of things, but I think that talking to some of the waste staff from these councils, that's constantly changing too in terms of landfill levies versus using the FOGO stream. So it's probably just worth keeping on top of that as that changes over the years, I suppose, because from an emissions point of view, it's a bit of a no-brainer that weekly collection makes a very big difference. So this is the last graph, I think, which is really around, this was talking back to the eager councils around what do we do with this information and kind of where to from here. This graph is about, this is the diversion rate thing I spoke to before. So what these percentages are is the percentage of all the food we're throwing away that is making it into the FOGO bins. So that dotted line is the average at 40%, which means as an eager region, we're not even yet getting half of our food waste into the FOGO bins. 60% of it is still going into the garbage bin. So while FOGO is already a success story in terms of emissions reduction, this graph was a bit of a kind of challenge being set, I suppose, as the work that's still to be done around really upping that diversion rate, even for the councils that were kind of the current high achievers, to really consider that last 40, 50% of the food that's still going in the bin. How do we shift that? And there was some really good talk around the value of community education and kind of using this data and next steps and properly kind of understanding what are the factors that are influencing so many residents to still put a fair bit of food waste in the garbage bin. So hopefully kind of helpful information that can foster ongoing work, but the job is definitely not fully complete yet. Just thought I'd share the recommendations now that came from Blue Environment in terms of for what councils do now with this information. The first is kind of pretty obvious given what we've already talked about, but it was really just saying from an emissions reductions perspective, weekly is the way to go, combined with that ongoing education, which was really about that diversion rate, getting that up higher. They did note the value of having that bin audit data. I think in the end, we were able to get audit data from all eager councils, but it's not necessarily a kind of fully consistent or mandated thing. So they were just reminding people that it ups the value of the data to have that. Ideally, you do it annually so that you can be putting your updated values in when you're doing your emissions year on year. The other interesting finding was around the landfill gas capture rates and just the fact that actually none of our councils were able to provide them and don't get that information from their landfill providers as a regular part of their contract. And so hence the tool is mostly built on the default values and state averages. There is the function within there to put your actual landfill provider's gas capture rate in there. We would hope that as that improves over time, that will obviously change the outputs. But so it was really a prompt to encourage people when they're signing those contracts to really ask for the sharing of that information to be a part of that agreement. And lastly, obviously, very shameless plug to use the calculator and aim to use it annually so that you get the benefits from that learning, particularly those trends over time, to monitor how changes in whether it's your community education activities or delivery modifications, that you can start to understand the impacts that those changes are having on your emissions reduction. So next steps for us, I guess, from here, just reiterating that the tool is available on the eager website. Hopefully that version works for people. If it doesn't, please sing out. We would really, encourage you to use it and have a play with it. Obviously, as an eager region, we did it together and we did it all at the same time. So we did have that extra layer of sharing that information as a group to build understanding, to analyse differences, and there was that real sense of shared kind of capacity building. So if you're in an alliance and in a region and already in communication with your neighbouring councils, I'd really encourage you to perhaps get back to your alliance rep and think about doing it as a region as well, so you get those added benefits. And going even slightly bigger scale, we are considering the opportunity to build that into a statewide data set. So if we want to choose to invest in coordinating collection of data across more of Victoria, that would be really quite impactful data for us to have around advocating for the impact of FOGO programs, for councils' management of them, and kind of having a good story to tell about the statewide impact on emissions reduction. So that's something we're talking about already as alliances across the whole state. No doubt you'll hear more about it from your alliance rep, but really encourage the two-way process, that if you're here today and you are a member of an alliance, to plug back in with your alliance staff and talk about that as a region, but also your interest in feeding into that bigger picture advocacy work as well. I think I've already spoken to that. So I reckon let's move on to questions. I'll stop sharing. And I haven't been able to track the chat. So Scott, I might throw to you from here.
All good. Great presentation, Mel. The first one's more of a statement, but maybe I can turn it into a question. It's from Nathan. Nillumbik data would need to go back to 2003. I'm guessing that this is when perhaps they started with some sort of FOGO program, and perhaps this is what they would need to establish as their baseline year. Do you want to talk briefly about the difference between sort of the BAU versus the fixed baseline data?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that if you have had FOGO for that long, it's true that you would need to go back to a year that you didn't have FOGO in operation to make it work. And obviously, if that's a very long time ago, then the world looked quite different then. You might have had less people living, particularly somewhere like Nillumbik. You might have had less population. So look, the tool is set up if you wanted to do a pure flat analysis on emissions from that year to current year. You can do that. It's a fair bit less valuable though because of things like population change, but also the emissions factors of the electricity system, as obviously more renewables have come into the grid. So, but that's just a simple toggle. You would still put the original 2003 data in there with the old, or exactly how it was. And if you just toggle to the business as usual, it will naturally update all of the emissions, the factors, the landfill gas capture rates to the current year. So it's an actual fair, comparison across where you'd be right now if you hadn't implemented FOGO versus where you actually are. Is that clear enough?
I think so. Hopefully
the more you talk about it, the less clear it feels sometimes.
clear as mud.
Yeah.
We'll move on to Paul's question. What kind of sample sizes are different councils using in their composition audits? If any of the eager councils are online, they might want to jump in here. But that question around what's representative or not did come up quite a lot in the discussions. And I think the default position is the larger the better. But it's resource and budget constrained. Do you have anything else to add to that one, Mel?
No, only that it's really simple to toggle between your audit results and the state averages. So even just as a bit of a sense check, if you wanted to toggle it back to state averages and see whether your council's wildly different. And another value of doing it year on year is obviously, again, you can sense check across years if you're seeing any kind of real outliers. But no, it was a definite concern. And I don't think there's a perfect solution, given we're probably not going to be, quadrupling the amount of audits we're doing. So not a perfect system, but the best we can do at this point.
Oh, good. This one's from Jason. Is there a comparison looking at the weekly, fortnightly FOGO collection versus the difference in fuel use between the weekly and fortnightly rounds? Again, this came up quite a lot and general sort of concern that inventory item would be a significant one, but the results kind of indicate that it's not really super material when you stack it alongside the direct emissions from landfill. And I seem to remember the consultants wheeling out some sort of statistic saying that you could drive the truck around Australia a couple of times and you can generate less emissions than the landfill does. Or is that sort of right, Mel?
Yeah, definitely. The other thing is one of the graphs it spits out at the end, which looks at the total emissions reduction, actually itemizes them. So the transport emissions are in there as their own colour. So you can kind of see the increase in transport emissions. For most councils that are doing weekly FOGO, they're doing fortnightly garbage. So there's some sort of trade-off there as well in terms of it's just changing which trucks are driving around as opposed to more rounds altogether.
Yeah, all good. Nick's got a pretty funny comment blaming his parents for the Stonington results, but I think it also speaks to a sort of generational and behavioural change aspect that's really hard. There was also a bit of a prevailing view in eager councils that the more money and resources put into that behaviour change and communication piece, the better diversion rates that they thought they would get as an outcome.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know
The
if
other
there's
thing
any
with
thoughts, further
Stonington
thoughts.
was definitely the more like apartments and kind of denser. So there was stuff around just issues with actual bin space. So expecting everybody to have a FOGO bin and fitting it at the bottom of those apartment blocks with 50 other bins. And the other thing to flag probably was that private collections. So if you've got private contractors, say, collecting from large apartment buildings, and obviously if it's not obvious without saying commercial as well, weren't included in this. So potentially for Stonington, if you've got a bigger proportion of the community that is using private contractors for, bigger buildings as well, compounding that with the kind of space problem, I think they do have a couple of unique factors to,
Yeah,
give them. Yeah.
totally. There's a few comments here that aren't really questions. I'll skip back to Paul. Do waste emission factors need to be updated in the back end of the tool year on year?
I think there's a sheet around that. That's a good question. I didn't click that far over. There are a couple more sheets. Are the Angus factors updated every year? I don't think they are. I thought that was like a multi-year thing, but they are in the background and over long term they would need updating, I think, is my answer to that. Does that sound
All,
right to you?
yeah, all the emission factors can be changed, manually changed, within the tool. So yeah, please refer to those sheets and have a look.
Yeah.
Um, this one's from Luke at SV. Has there been any interest from interstate New South Wales and WA, for example? Not yet, but happy to have a chat with our friends in other jurisdictions and share learnings, run another briefing. So yeah, if you want to follow that one up, Luke, we can have a chat afterwards and kick off those conversations. Um, this one's from Alex, and this one's specifically around implementing FOGO in rural areas. So I'm not sure if Mel and I will have the answer, but does the program yield more overall benefits or present greater impacts due to the long transport distances?
Hmm. We don't. I don't really know, except to say, probably reiterating what you said about transport isn't actually a huge piece of the puzzle when you look at it all. So, but yeah, beyond that, I'm not sure. Would be interesting to know if we could manage a statewide collation, couldn't it? If we could get all
Yeah.
those regional councils to use the tool.
Yeah. Almost at the bottom here. Dean, was methane capture and flaring at landfills taken into account when calculating the emissions impact? Mel did touch on this briefly, and we weren't able to get the methane capture rates for any of the landfills where the waste from eager councils were getting sent. But in the instances where that is in place, it would have a material impact on the emissions from that particular landfill. So I believe Blue Environment did actually reach out to the landfill operators as part of this and didn't really get anything back. I think there was one of them mentioned in their annual report that they were looking at it or doing some investigation. Is that right, Mel?
That sounds right. But yeah, that's where the recommendation came from really at the end to say that was a gap. Even with individual follow up, it was hard. So maybe the contract is the time to kind of request that to be
Yep.
shared. Yeah, which is why the state averages are there as a default in the tool.
Okay. So another one from Luke. Does the tool capture contamination rates in FOGO?
Yes. So that's what the bin audit is, I suppose. Like it shows the amount of inert waste and other non-food waste but it is only based on audit, so it's subject to the limitations of that process as we talked about, but contamination is in there. Yeah.
Just one further point on this. Some years ago, a couple of the EGA councils looked at implementing FOGO and generating ACCUs under as a means of generating additional revenue to support the scheme itself. The business case didn't really stack up, but as part of those generic calculation methodologies, the assumptions in that was that a small amount of contamination in the FOGO stream would mean a large amount of that entire truckload or whatever just going back to landfill. When we actually toured a FOGO processing facility that 5 of the 8 councils were sending their streams to, that wasn't the actual case. So there was a very small amount of contamination that was being effectively removed, and they reported that only a truckload would only go back when there's something very significant perhaps got pulled into the stream, like an entire bin, for instance. So yeah, so I think some of the assumptions in some of those models don't quite stand up when you do a little bit of investigation around what happens in practice.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's it for questions.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, a few good comments and kind of additional bits in the chat there, which is great too.
Yeah. Dean's just saying you could possibly check the NGA's reports. Companies like Viola who manage landfills need to report NGAs. So yeah, that might be another bit of data councils can look into.
Yeah. I wonder if you're referring there, Dean, to still referring to the methane capture, because I assume that's where they did get the state averages from. But yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, yeah, please just probably reiterating that we're really open for follow up. And like I said, we'll be working with the other alliances. So if you are a member of Alliance, please connect back that way because we think there's quite a lot of possibility now that the tool's done, the hard work's there. It's not, hopefully, you can see after looking at it today, it's not super hard to use, but the value will come in more of us using it and using it over multiple years. So let's keep talking.
And well done to Mel for wrangling this project for the councils. It's been a really great one. Thanks, everybody.
See ya. Thanks for coming.